What I wanted to talk about in my section was really about the way in which we've become very aware of the distress a lot of young women feel about their bodies, but our responses to it often fit into the same framework from which the distress comes, and they can be quite counterproductive. So I wanted to start by talking about a term that we hear more and more these days from both anti-feminists and some people who claim to be feminists, and that's this idea of weaponizing trauma. I find it a deeply unpleasant term, and it tends to get used in situations when women describe traumatic experiences in such a way that might demand a response that's very politically inconvenient. And it turns out a lot of women's traumatic experiences fall into that category. So female trauma is just a huge inconvenience to the smooth running of any patriarchal society. It makes people uncomfortable, it places a burden on others, and one way of responding to it, it could be to change how relationships operate so that women and girls are no longer being traumatized. But that would require a lot of change and a lot of sacrifices on the part of men and boys. And another way is just to ignore female trauma, only sometimes it just can't be ignored, it's right there in front of you. A third way could be to make dealing with trauma the work of women and girls themselves, so it's another thing for them to fix. Instead of weaponizing it, they should regard it as a flaw in themselves. If they can't eradicate it, they shouldn't make it so visible. As you can see, like Judith Butler said of J.K. Rowling, she shouldn't have capitalized on a history of sexual trauma in order to afflict and persecute others. In other words, she should have just shut up. An awful lot of the time, though, traumatized women and girls do shut up. There's a very long history of us turning the trauma that's inflicted on our bodies back onto these bodies themselves. We might not have the physical capacity to fight back, and we might fear the response if we speak, so we hurt ourselves. We starve ourselves, we cut ourselves, or we crush parts of ourselves that we don't want other people to see. These can be very personal, private activities, even done without any form of conscious intent, but nonetheless they're not always invisible. There comes a point at which harm that girls inflict on their bodies and their hatred of those bodies are noticed by other people. And this again is very inconvenient if you've got a society that wishes to exploit female bodies, but also push the narrative that women and girls naturally consent to whatever is being done to them, that maybe even they enjoy it. So right now, I think female body hatred is an enormous problem, particularly amongst adolescent girls. I think, however, we need to acknowledge that different people find it problematic in different ways and for different reasons. For girls themselves and those that truly care about them, it's immensely, immediately distressing. But for society as a whole, it's also embarrassing and inconvenient, and sometimes it actually provokes a kind of rage. And this is why I'm thinking of this term weaponized trauma in terms of how we see these girls suffering. When attempting to educate girls to accept their bodies, and this has become a big thing, this way we're going to teach them to feel better, we need to take care. So are we fixing their distress or demanding that they make it less visible? If hating the body becomes a conduit through which a girl says, "Look at me, look at what you've done," even if she's not even thinking of trying to send that message, but it's still there, is it enough for us to just tell her she should feel better? So one area that I have some personal experience of is eating disorders. And so if you starve yourself down to a very low weight, people are going to see it. So, I suffered anorexia from around the age of 11, and this was the 1980s, and professional and public attitudes towards eating disorders were quite openly hostile. So anorexia sufferers back then was seen as kind of mini Karens, sort of selfish, controlling, vain. Controlling was often a word used in relation to anorexia, and also vanity. So treatment programs could be quite punitive. So you weren't really taught to love your body or accept it, but you were taught that you'd be force-fed and denied human contact unless you returned to a physically and socially acceptable state. So you looked like what an adolescent girl should look like. So Susie Orbach wrote in Hunger Strike The general consensus is that the patient has recovered when the normal weight is reached and appropriate sex role functioning is achieved. So she's not well, but she's not troublesome. It's only in very recent years I've come to question how much this might be seen in the context of a kind of weaponized trauma. This is an inconvenient performance of pain. So a high proportion of anorexia sufferers, and also like a high proportion of people suffering from gender dysphoria, they're female, they're approaching puberty, or maybe they've just entered it, and quite a high proportion as well might be survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And these are all very uncomfortable realities. And rather than confront what might be happening on a personal and political level, it's often easier to say that self-imposed starvation is it's either a moral flaw or it's a form of madness. Because otherwise we'd have to acknowledge that there's something specific about how the world treats girls at that particular age that makes a number of them resort to something that's very extreme and very visibly distressing. We'd have to grant their pain a political validity, and we'd have to take them seriously as subjects. We'd have to ask why, in the words of Hilary Mantel, some girls want out. Instead, we have punished them, or as happens now, in a supposedly more enlightened age, we might hunt for biological or genetic causes. And sometimes we might even treat anorexia as evidence that the suffering girl is actually a boy. And I've even seen it proposed that transition is some form of cure or realization that that's what the problem was all along. Now, I don't want to suggest that nothing is getting better. And it is true that we discuss female body hatred as a problem far more than I think was the case when I was younger. We do identify social causes for girls' distress, particularly in the unrealistic images girls see in social media, increasing availability of extreme pornography, and misogynistic attitudes among teenage boys. We educate girls and boys about these things, but I think there's a limit to how much telling girls, for instance, real women don't look like women in porn, is that helpful? Because I think girls know that already. One thing that worries me about this focus on educating the girls themselves, at least when it's not accompanied by meaningful political change, is that we end up teaching girls how to respond unobtrusively to their distress, how not to weaponize it, and often how to keep it under wraps. She should either learn to love her curves, or she should find a narrative that justifies crushing them or having them cut off. It's like learning a script in some sense. If she's ashamed of the space she occupies in the world, she's offered a way of kind of brazening it out in a way that won't impose on others and make them owe her some duty of care. And this is an impression I get sometimes when I hear politicians who talk about boosting girls' confidence while ignoring concerns about protecting girls' dignity and privacy in a very immediate sense. It's also a worry I have when I look at body positivity accounts on social media. Many of the women who run them are still experiencing a lot of distress about their bodies, but they'll couch it in terms of, my eating disorder voice was very loud today, or my dysphoria was very bad. And they're almost apologising for not presenting a pretty enough attitude to compensate for the bodies they've devoted these whole social media accounts to excusing. We know that girls are just not born hating themselves. They're taught this. And it's this layer that covers up the person she could be. But rather than scrape it away, the politics of body confidence risks just putting another layer on top of it. In their book Confidence Culture, Shani Orgad and Rosalind Gill describe this as another form of work imposed on women and girls. So they write, working on one's own self-confidence is, for women, a self-care practice and a means by which they are made responsible for their own success or failure, understood not through accounts of structural inequality or social injustice, but in personal, psychological terms. They also note that while body confidence messages often have a warm and affirmative glow, they work to instill a new layer of discipline for women, a discipline that involves making over subjectivity to become an upgraded, confident subject. And I think it's imperative we find other ways of contextualising the distress girls feel, not least because body confidence sets a target that no one can hit when we're living in a world with other people. I know many sort of ostensibly stable eating disorder sufferers will say, oh, but still, you never fully recover, as though there's some inner flaw that they will carry for life, branding every negative thought about food and their body a disordered one. And this isn't something that I personally believe or experience, but this isn't because I love my body or never feel guilt or distress about food. I think what we need to make clear is that none of us can ever opt out of this ongoing relationship with food, with femaleness, with the body and with the world around us. It's always going to be there, and we can't shut ourselves off from how others respond to our bodies or dictate what these bodies mean in isolation. So none of us is ever going to achieve this pure, neutral state of just being. Rather than desensitize ourselves, we need to keep fighting for social change to make our bodies acceptable among other peoples. And we can't fix feelings alone when these feelings are actual rational responses. So helping girls to understand why they feel the way they do isn't enough. We need to teach them about pornography, but also we need to adopt a position in relation to it and in relation to the morality of it. Although we're not being puritanical. And we need to, and teaching them to feel comfortable in their own skins isn't enough if we were also eroding their boundaries and right to say no in personal spaces. And telling them to love their bodies isn't enough if we're still participating in the demonization of older women, because these are their future selves. They're going to make them fear their future selves. So that would be counterproductive. So challenging the world while supporting girls to live in it as it is right now and not as we want it to be is, I think, the real challenge. So girls, they're not weaponizing trauma. They're trying to find ways to survive it. And we owe it to them to listen.